September 12, 1943. A Tuesday morning that would change the small farming community of Greeley, Colorado forever. Martha Weber stood on her front porch, coffee cup trembling in her hands, watching a convoy of military trucks rumble down Main Street. Dust clouds rose behind the vehicles, coating the storefronts in a fine layer of prairie grit. Her neighbors emerged from their homes one by one, drawn by the unusual commotion. The war had always felt distant to Greeley, something that happened in newspapers and radio broadcasts, in places with foreign names that most locals couldn't pronounce. But now the war was driving right through the center of town, and it wore the face of the enemy. Inside those canvas-covered trucks sat 240 German prisoners of war, captured in North Africa during the Allied campaign against Rommel's forces. They were being transported to a newly constructed POW camp just 3 miles outside of town, built on what had been the Henderson family's wheat fields. The camp had gone up quickly over the summer, its guard towers and barbed wire fences rising from the flat Colorado landscape like some strange industrial crop. Nobody in Greeley had been particularly happy about having enemy soldiers housed so close to their homes. Letters had been written to congressmen, town hall meetings had grown heated, but the War Department's decision was final. Martha's husband Robert had died at Pearl Harbor. His ship, the USS Arizona, had gone down with him still inside it. She wore black most days, not out of tradition, but because reaching for colored dresses in her closet felt like a betrayal of his memory. Now she was watching German soldiers, allies of the Japanese who had killed Robert, being brought to live just down the road. The bitter irony wasn't lost on her. Her grip tightened on the coffee cup until her knuckles went white. Across the street, Eleanor Hodges clutched her 6-year-old son Tommy close to her side. Her husband Frank was somewhere in Italy with the Fifth Army. His last letter had arrived 3 weeks ago, talking about heavy fighting near Salerno. Every day without news felt like holding her breath underwater. Now she was supposed to accept that enemy soldiers would be sleeping just a few miles from where her son played in the yard. The thought made her stomach turn. Through gaps in the canvas covers, glimpses of gray uniforms and pale faces could be seen. The German prisoners stared out at the small American town with expressions that ranged from curiosity to resignation. Among them was a young man named Klaus Richter. At 24 years old, he had kind eyes that seemed at odds with his Wehrmacht uniform. Before the war, he had been a music teacher in a small Bavarian village. He had never wanted to be a soldier. The army had taken him in 1941, and getting captured had felt almost like relief. The convoy turned east, leaving Main Street behind. Back in town, Martha finally lowered her coffee cup. The dust settled on the empty street, but the unease remained. The POW camp sat in a shallow valley where the Henderson wheat fields had once grown golden in the summer Sunday. Now, those fields were divided by double rows of barbed wire fencing, guard towers at each corner, and long wooden barracks arranged in precise military rows. The trucks rolled through the main gate one by one, their engines coughing diesel smoke into the clear Colorado air. As each vehicle came to a stop, German prisoners climbed down stiffly, their legs cramped from the long journey from the processing center in Kansas. Klaus Richter was among the last to disembark. He stood for a moment, stretching his back and looking around at his new home. The Rocky Mountains rose in the distance, their peaks still holding patches of snow even in September. He had never seen mountains like these. Bavaria had mountains too, but these American peaks seemed bigger somehow, more imposing. Everything about America felt oversized to him. The vast empty spaces, the wide sky, the sense that the land went on forever in every direction. An American sergeant with a weathered face and tired eyes began shouting orders in English. Most of the German prisoners understood little of what he said, but his gestures were clear enough. They were to form lines, submit to inspection, and then be assigned to barracks. The process was efficient and impersonal. Klaus found himself herded along with dozens of other men, all of them wearing the same weary expressions of soldiers who had stopped caring about military precision. The inspection was thorough but not cruel. American guards searched through their few possessions, confiscated anything that might be used as a weapon, and checked their identification tags against typed lists. Klaus carried almost nothing with him. A small photograph of his mother and sister taken before the war. A letter from his sister dated 8 months ago. The last one that had reached him in Africa. A Lutheran prayer book with a cracked leather cover. The guard who searched him was young, probably no older than Klaus himself. He handled the photograph carefully, looked at it for a moment, then handed it back without comment. After inspection, Klaus was assigned to Barrack 7, along with 35 other men. The building was simple but sturdy, with rows of metal cots and thin mattresses. Small windows near the ceiling let in afternoon light. It was clean, dry, and infinitely better than the tents they had lived in during the desert campaign. Several of the prisoners actually smiled as they claimed their cots. That evening the prisoners received their first meal in the camp: bread, soup, and coffee. It wasn't much, but it was hot, and there was enough of it. As Klaus ate, he listened to conversations around him. Some men talked about escape, though everyone knew that was foolish. Others speculated about how long the war would last. Klaus said nothing, just stared at his mother's photograph and wondered if he would ever see home again. The work program began on the third day. American farmers in the region were desperate for labor. Their sons and hired hands had gone off to war, leaving crops to rot in the fields and livestock untended. The Geneva Convention allowed prisoners of war to be used for agricultural work, so arrangements had been made quickly. Each morning, groups of German prisoners would be loaded onto trucks and driven to nearby farms, where they would work under guard supervision until evening. Klaus found himself assigned to a crew of 20 men who would work the surrounding farms on a rotating basis. Their first assignment was the Weber property, a modest 160 acres that grew sugar beets and corn. When the truck pulled up to the farmhouse that first morning, Klaus saw a woman in a dark dress standing on the porch. Even from a distance, he could see the rigid set of her shoulders, the way she held herself as if bracing against a strong wind. This was Martha Weber, though Klaus didn't know her name yet. The American guard, Corporal Davies, assigned the prisoners to different sections of the field where sugar beets needed harvesting. It was backbreaking work, bending low to pull the heavy roots from the soil, cutting off the green tops, and loading them into carts. Klaus didn't mind physical labor. It gave him something to focus on, besides the uncertainty of his situation. His hands, which had once coaxed music from piano keys, now pulled vegetables from Colorado dirt. By mid-morning, the September sun had grown warm. Klaus worked steadily, falling into a rhythm that made the time pass more quickly. He was bent over a particularly stubborn beet when he heard footsteps approaching through the field. He looked up to see Martha Weber walking toward the work crew, carrying a large metal container. Behind her walked a younger woman with auburn hair tied back in a practical bun. This was Sarah Mitchell, Martha's neighbor who had come to help with the harvest. Corporal Davies met them halfway, and Klaus watched as Martha said something to him in a low voice. The corporal nodded, then turned to the prisoners and called out in his rough German that there was water available. The prisoners straightened up gratefully, several of them heading toward where Martha and Sarah had set down the container. Klaus hung back, uncertain. He had seen the look on Martha's face when they arrived. He didn't want to presume anything. But as the other men drank and returned to work, Klaus's thirst got the better of him. He approached the water container slowly, keeping his eyes downcast. As he reached for the ladle, he glanced up and found himself looking directly at Sarah Mitchell. She was younger than he had first thought, probably around his own age. Her eyes were green, he noticed. Green like the forests in Bavaria. For just a moment, their eyes met, and something passed between them. Not attraction exactly, not yet, but recognition. The recognition that they were both young people caught up in something neither of them had chosen. Sarah looked away first, her cheeks coloring slightly. Klaus took his drink quickly and returned to work, but he could feel her presence in the field, even when his back was turned. The work crew returned to the Weber farm 3 times that first week. Each day followed the same pattern. The prisoners would arrive at dawn, work until noon, break for a simple lunch provided by the army, then continue until the late afternoon sun made the work unbearable. Corporal Davies was a fair supervisor who didn't push the men beyond what was reasonable. He had fought in France during the First World War and seemed to have little personal animosity toward the Germans. To him, they were just soldiers who had lost, same as he might have been if luck had fallen differently. Sarah Mitchell appeared at the farm each day, helping Martha with various tasks. Her own farm was smaller, managed now by her aging father since her brother had enlisted in the Navy. She came to Martha's place partly to help, partly to escape the loneliness of her own empty house. At 23 years old, Sarah had expected to be married by now, but the war had taken away most of the young men she had grown up with. She told herself she wasn't watching the German prisoners as they worked. She was simply observing, making sure they weren't causing trouble. But her eyes kept finding their way back to one prisoner in particular. The tall one, with gentle features, who worked with steady efficiency. She had learned from Corporal Davies that his name was Klaus, that he had been a teacher before the war. The information had surprised her. She had imagined all German soldiers as brutal, mindless followers of Hitler. But this man didn't look brutal. He looked tired and sad and far from home. On the fourth day, something unexpected happened. Klaus was working near the fence line when he noticed something moving in the irrigation ditch. He stopped and looked closer, then carefully set down his tools and knelt by the water. Sarah, who had been hanging laundry nearby, watched with curiosity. She saw Klaus reach into the ditch and pull out something small and struggling. A kitten, barely old enough to be away from its mother, had somehow fallen into the water and was drowning. Klaus held the tiny creature gently in his large hands, using his thumbs to clear water from its nose and mouth. The kitten coughed and mewed pitifully. He looked around, spotted an old feed sack hanging on the fence, and carefully wrapped the kitten in it to keep it warm. Then he stood there, uncertain what to do next. He couldn't take the animal back to the barracks. Pets weren't allowed. But he couldn't just leave it to die either. Sarah found herself walking toward him before she consciously decided to move. She crossed the space between the laundry line and the field, her heart beating faster with each step. When she reached him, Klaus looked up with startled eyes. He held out the bundle toward her, and in halting English said, "Please, is needing help." Sarah took the kitten from him, their fingers brushing briefly in the exchange. The touch lasted only a second, but both of them felt it. She looked down at the tiny creature, then back up at Klaus. "Thank you," she said quietly. Klaus nodded, not trusting himself to say more. October arrived with cooler temperatures and the first hints of winter in the mountain air. The work crews continued their rotation through the local farms, and Klaus's group found themselves returning to the Weber property regularly. The sugar beet harvest was nearly complete, but there was always more work to be done. Fences needed mending, irrigation ditches required clearing, and the corn needed to be brought in before the first hard freeze. Sarah had kept the kitten, nursing it back to health with warm milk and patience. She named it Pepper for its gray and white markings. The small creature had become a source of quiet joy in her life, something innocent and uncomplicated in a world that felt increasingly complex. She found herself thinking about the German prisoner who had saved it, wondering what kind of man stops in the middle of hard labor to rescue a drowning kitten. It didn't fit with the image of the enemy she had been taught to hate. One afternoon, Martha asked Sarah to bring lunch out to the work crew. Corporal Davies had driven into town for supplies, leaving a younger guard named Private Henderson to watch the prisoners. Sarah loaded a basket with sandwiches and a thermos of coffee, then walked out to the field where the men were working. She felt self-conscious as she approached, aware that 20 pairs of eyes were watching her. Most of the prisoners looked away respectfully, but Klaus met her gaze for just a moment before turning back to his work. She set the basket down and began distributing the sandwiches. The men accepted them with quiet thanks, some in German, a few in broken English. When she reached Klaus, he was the last in line. He took the sandwich she offered, and in careful English said, "The small cat is being well?" His grammar was imperfect, but his meaning was clear. Sarah felt something warm spread through her chest. He had been thinking about the kitten. He had cared enough to ask. "Yes," she replied, speaking slowly so he could understand. "She's healthy now, because of you." Klaus smiled then, a genuine smile that transformed his whole face. For just a moment, he didn't look like an enemy soldier or a prisoner of war. He looked like a young man who was pleased to have done something good. Sarah found herself smiling back, and the moment stretched between them, fragile and dangerous. Private Henderson called out that the break was over, and the spell broke. Klaus returned to work, but something had shifted. Over the following days, small exchanges became more frequent. A nod of greeting when the work crew arrived, a quiet, "good morning" in passing. Sarah began bringing small extras with the lunch basket, an apple tucked in beside Klaus's sandwich. An extra piece of bread. Nothing obvious enough to draw attention, but enough that he would know she was thinking of him. Klaus, for his part, began leaving small gifts at the edge of the field where Sarah would find them. A smooth stone from the irrigation ditch, a perfectly preserved autumn leaf. Once, a small carved figure of a bird, whittled from a piece of scrap wood during the evening hours at the camp. These tokens were exchanged without words, without acknowledgement in front of others. But both of them treasured these small gestures as proof that what they were feeling wasn't entirely one-sided. The carved wooden bird sat on Sarah's windowsill where she could see it first thing every morning. She had found it wrapped in a scrap of cloth near the water pump, placed where only she would think to look. The craftsmanship was remarkable. Delicate feathers were etched into the wood, and the bird's head was tilted, as if listening for something. She held it often in the evenings, running her fingers over the smooth surface and wondering what Klaus had been thinking as he carved it. Communication between them remained limited by language and circumstance. Klaus's English was improving, but complex thoughts remained difficult to express. Sarah knew no German beyond a few words she had picked up from overhearing the prisoners talk. Yet somehow they found ways to understand each other. A look could convey more than a conversation. The way Klaus's eyes softened when he saw her said things he couldn't put into words. The way Sarah's hands trembled slightly when she handed him his lunch spoke volumes about feelings she wasn't ready to acknowledge aloud. Martha noticed, of course. She was too observant not to see the way her young neighbor's face changed when the work crew arrived, or how one particular prisoner's gaze followed Sarah across the yard. One evening, as they sat on the porch shelling peas, Martha spoke carefully. "You need to be cautious, Sarah. People are watching. They're already suspicious of anyone who shows kindness to the Germans." Sarah's hand stilled over the bowl. She wanted to deny it, to pretend she didn't know what Martha meant, but she respected Martha too much to lie. "I know," Sarah said quietly. "I don't understand it myself. He's supposed to be the enemy. My brother is fighting his countrymen somewhere in Europe, but when I look at him, I don't see an enemy. I see someone who's lost and far from home. Someone who saved a kitten when he didn't have to." Martha was silent for a long moment, her own hands working mechanically through the pile of pea pods. Finally, she sighed deeply. "My Robert used to say that war makes us forget we're all human underneath the uniforms," Martha said. "I hated the Japanese after Pearl Harbor. Part of me still does. But these Germans working my fields, they're not monsters. They're just boys who got caught up in something bigger than themselves." She looked at Sarah with worried eyes. "That doesn't mean it's safe for you to care about one of them. This town won't forgive something like that. Neither will your family." Sarah knew Martha was right. Already she had heard whispers at church about women who were too friendly with the prisoners. The word sympathizer was being thrown around, and worse terms too. In town there was talk of women in other states who had been shunned or even attacked for being seen with German prisoners. The danger was real. But knowing the danger didn't make her feelings disappear. If anything, the forbidden nature of what she felt made it burn brighter. That night, Sarah lay awake wondering if it was possible to love someone you could barely speak to. November brought the first snow, light dustings that melted by midday but reminded everyone that winter was coming. The work on the farms slowed as the harvest ended, and the prisoner work crews were reassigned to other tasks. Some went to a lumber mill 20 miles north. Others were sent to help with road maintenance. Klaus's group remained on farm rotation, but the assignments became less frequent. Sometimes a week would pass between visits to the Weber property. Those weeks felt endless to Sarah. She tried to fill her days with normal activities, helping her father with their own farm, attending church, participating in the women's war effort, knitting socks and rolling bandages. But everything felt hollow when she couldn't see Klaus. She scolded herself for being foolish. This couldn't go anywhere. Even if the war ended tomorrow, he would be sent back to Germany. They had no future together. Yet her heart refused to listen to reason. When the work crew finally returned to Martha's farm in mid-November, Sarah's hands shook as she prepared the lunch basket. She had written him a letter, just a few simple sentences in English that she hoped he could understand. She had rewritten it a dozen times, afraid of saying too much, afraid of not saying enough. In the end, she had settled on honesty. "I think about you every day. I know this is wrong. I don't care anymore." She folded the paper small and tucked it into an apple, cutting a small hole and pressing the note inside before replacing the piece she had removed. That afternoon, when she brought lunch to the field, she made sure the apple went to Klaus. He took it with a questioning look, noticing its weight was wrong. She met his eyes briefly and gave the smallest nod. He understood. That evening, back at the camp, Klaus sat on his cot and carefully extracted the note from the apple. His hands trembled as he read her words. He had been trying to convince himself that what he felt was one-sided, that he was projecting his loneliness onto a kind face. But here was proof that she felt it too. He spent the entire night composing his response, writing in careful English with help from Otto, who had worked as a translator before the war. "You are in my thoughts always. Like music I cannot stop hearing. I know we have no future, but I cannot make my heart be practical. You have shown me that kindness still exists in this world." He carved a small wooden heart, no bigger than a walnut, and wrapped the note around it. 2 days later, he left it where she would find it, hidden beneath a loose board near the water pump. When Sarah discovered it, she pressed it to her lips and let herself cry for the first time since this had all begun. These were tears of joy and grief mixed together, the knowledge that she had found something precious and impossible at the same time. Winter settled over Greeley with unusual harshness that year. By December, the temperature dropped well below freezing most nights, and snow piled high along the streets. The prisoner work program slowed to a crawl. Most of the Germans spent their days in the camp, attending classes, doing maintenance work, or simply trying to stay warm in barracks that were never quite heated enough. The town's attitude toward the prisoners had begun to shift in unexpected ways. It started with small gestures. Mrs. Chen, who ran the general store, donated old coats and blankets to the camp. Reverend Thompson organized a clothing drive at the Methodist Church, arguing that treating prisoners humanely was both a Christian duty and good policy. Not everyone agreed. There were still those who saw any kindness toward the Germans as a betrayal of American boys fighting overseas. But gradually, more families began to see the prisoners as individuals rather than as faceless enemies. Farmers who had worked alongside the Germans spoke up at town meetings, describing them as hardworking and respectful. The camp commander, Colonel Morrison, invited local leaders to tour the facility, showing them that the prisoners were well-behaved and posed no threat to the community. He emphasized that most of these men had been conscripted, that they hadn't chosen to fight for Hitler any more than American draftees had chosen their service. Christmas approached, and with it came an unusual proposal. Several of the German prisoners had musical training, and they requested permission to give a concert for the camp guards and any local residents who wished to attend. Colonel Morrison approved the idea, seeing it as good for morale on both sides. An announcement was posted in town, and to everyone's surprise, more than 100 locals showed up on the evening of December 20th. Sarah sat with Martha near the back of the camp's assembly hall. Her father had refused to come, saying he wouldn't watch enemy soldiers perform like they were honored guests. But Sarah couldn't stay away, knowing that Klaus would be among the musicians. She had learned from Corporal Davies that Klaus played piano, that before the war he had taught music to children. The thought of hearing him play made her heart race. The concert began with traditional German Christmas carols. The prisoners' voices harmonized beautifully, filling the simple hall with music that transcended language and nationality. Then Klaus sat down at an old upright piano that had been donated to the camp. His fingers moved across the keys, and suddenly the room was filled with the achingly beautiful melody of Silent Night. He played it first in the German style, then shifted seamlessly into the American version. Sarah watched his hands, those same hands that had pulled a kitten from drowning water, that had carved wooden gifts for her, now creating something so beautiful that several people in the audience wiped tears from their eyes. In that moment, she understood something profound. Music was what he was meant to do. Teaching, creating beauty, bringing joy to others. War had stolen that from him, just as it had stolen so much from everyone. After the Christmas concert, something changed in Greeley. The music had reminded people of shared humanity, of a world that existed beyond the war. Conversations about the prisoners became less heated. More families began accepting their presence as simply part of life during wartime. This subtle shift in the town's atmosphere gave Sarah a dangerous sense of hope. If people could accept the prisoners as human beings, perhaps someday they might accept something more. She began writing to Klaus regularly, hiding letters in places only he would think to look. Behind a loose stone in the fence post, under the feed trough, near where his work crew gathered. Each hiding spot became their secret language, a map of connection that only they could read. Her letters grew longer and more personal with each passing week. She told him about her childhood, about losing her mother when she was 12, about her dreams of seeing the ocean someday. She wrote about small-town life, about her father's stubbornness, about the loneliness that had filled her days before Klaus arrived. Klaus wrote back in careful English that improved with each letter. He told her about Bavaria, about the mountains and forests of his homeland. He described his mother's garden where roses grew against the south wall of their cottage. He wrote about teaching children to play piano, how their faces would light up when they finally mastered a difficult passage. He shared his fears about what had happened to his family, his guilt about not being there to protect them during the bombing raids. Their letters became a lifeline for both of them. In a world where everything felt uncertain and dangerous, these stolen moments of written intimacy provided something solid to hold on to. Sarah kept his letters hidden in a box beneath loose floorboards in her bedroom. She would read them late at night by candlelight, tracing his handwriting with her fingers, imagining his voice speaking the words aloud. One letter from Klaus arrived in late January that made Sarah's heart stop. "I dream of a world where I could walk with you in daylight," he wrote, "where I could speak your name without fear, where loving you would not be considered a crime against both our countries. But we do not live in that world. So I take what moments we have and hold them like treasures. Every smile you give me, every word you write, I store them in my memory against the day when we must say goodbye." The reality of that eventual goodbye loomed over everything they shared. The war couldn't last forever. When it ended, Klaus would be repatriated to Germany. They both knew this. Yet neither of them could bring themselves to stop what had begun. Sarah wrote back with equal honesty, "I would rather have these stolen moments with you than a lifetime of safety with someone I don't love. Whatever happens when the war ends, I will never regret knowing you." February brought news that made their situation more complicated. Several German prisoners at camps across the country had requested to remain in America after the war. The secret couldn't last forever. Secrets never do in small towns where everyone watches everyone else. On a cold morning in early March, Sarah's father discovered one of Klaus's letters. She had been careless, leaving it tucked inside a book on the kitchen table while she went out to feed the chickens. William Mitchell was a hard man, made harder by the war that had taken his son overseas and left him alone to work a farm that was too much for one aging body to manage. He read the letter with growing disbelief and rage. When Sarah returned to the house, she found him standing in the kitchen, the paper clutched in his weathered hands. His face had gone pale, except for 2 spots of angry red on his cheeks. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Sarah felt her world tilting sideways, all the fear she had been pushing down for months suddenly flooding through her. "Explain this," her father said, his voice dangerously quiet. Sarah's throat went dry. She had rehearsed this conversation 100 times in her mind, had prepared arguments and explanations. But now, facing her father's fury, all her planned words disappeared. She could only tell him the truth. "His name is Klaus. He's a music teacher. He's kind and gentle, and I love him." The slap came without warning, her father's hand connecting with her cheek hard enough to snap her head to the side. He had never struck her before in her 23 years. The shock of it hurt worse than the physical pain. "You shame this family," he hissed. "Your brother is risking his life fighting Germans, and you're writing love letters to one of them? Have you lost your mind?" Sarah held her burning cheek, tears streaming down her face. "He didn't choose this war any more than David did. He's just a man who got caught up in something he never wanted." Her father's face twisted with contempt. "He's the enemy. That's all he is. That's all he'll ever be." He threw the letter into the wood stove, where it caught fire and curled into ash. "This ends now. You will not see him again. You will not write to him. You will not speak of him. If I hear that you've had any contact with that prisoner, I will go to the authorities myself." The threat hung in the air between them. Consorting with enemy prisoners could bring serious consequences. At minimum, public shame and social ostracism. At worst, accusations of being a traitor, of providing aid and comfort to the enemy. Sarah knew her father wasn't bluffing. He would turn her in if she defied him. She nodded slowly, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. That night, she lay in bed and made her decision. She couldn't stop loving Klaus just because her father demanded it, but she would have to be more careful. Much more careful. The stakes had just become dangerous in ways she had tried not to think about. Word spread through Greeley faster than Sarah had imagined possible. Her father, despite his threat to go to the authorities, had instead gone to Reverend Thompson, seeking counsel about his daughter's transgression. The Reverend, bound by no vow of secrecy, had mentioned it to his wife. Mrs. Thompson had told her sister. By the end of the week, half the town knew that Sarah Mitchell had been corresponding with a German prisoner. The reaction was swift and brutal. Women who had been friendly for years crossed the street to avoid speaking to her. At the general store, Mrs. Chen served her with tight-lipped disapproval. Anonymous letters appeared under her door, calling her a traitor, and worse names that made her hands shake as she read them. Someone painted a swastika on the fence of her father's property. The shame and anger in the community was palpable. But not everyone turned against her. Martha Weber appeared at Sarah's door 3 days after the news broke. She carried a basket of bread and sat at Sarah's kitchen table with quiet determination. "I won't abandon you," Martha said simply. "I know what it's like to lose someone you love to this war. I won't pretend to understand your feelings for that German boy, but I know you're not a traitor." Her support, coming from a woman who had lost her husband at Pearl Harbor, meant everything to Sarah. Others began to speak up as well. Mrs. Henderson, whose son had worked as a guard at the camp, defended Sarah at a town meeting. "That girl showed kindness to a prisoner who showed kindness to her. Since when is that a crime?" Several farmers who had worked alongside the German prisoners nodded in agreement. They had seen these men up close, had shared lunch breaks and small conversations with them. It was harder to hate people you knew as individuals. The town divided into two camps. Those who saw Sarah's actions as unforgivable betrayal, and those who believed that compassion, even toward enemies, was not something to be punished. The debate grew heated, appearing in letters to the local newspaper and dominating conversations at every gathering. Colonel Morrison was questioned about security at the camp. Had the prisoners been allowed too much freedom? Were other inappropriate relationships developing? Through all of this, Klaus knew nothing of what Sarah was enduring. The work crews had been suspended due to late winter storms, and no one thought to tell the German prisoners about the controversy their presence had caused. He only knew that 2 weeks had passed without any letters from Sarah, without any sign that she was thinking of him. He worried that she had changed her mind, that reality had finally convinced her that what they felt was impossible. Then, on a gray March afternoon, Corporal Davies pulled Klaus aside during the daily roll call. "I have a message for you," he said quietly. "From Miss Mitchell. She wants you to know that her feelings haven't changed, but it's not safe right now. She asks you to wait." Spring came late to Colorado that year. March melted into April with lingering cold and occasional snow flurries that felt more like winter's refusal to surrender than true seasonal weather. The prisoner work program resumed slowly, but Klaus's crew was deliberately assigned to farms on the opposite side of the county from the Weber property. Colonel Morrison had made it clear that he wanted to avoid any further controversy. The camp's relationship with the town was delicate enough without adding fuel to existing fires. Klaus worked mechanically through his days, his mind always somewhere else. At night, he lay on his cot and stared at the ceiling, wondering if he had ruined Sarah's life simply by existing in it. Otto, who had become his closest friend in the camp, tried to console him. "Maybe it's better this way," Otto said one evening. "What future could you have with her anyway? When the war ends, we go home. She stays here. It's impossible." But Klaus couldn't accept that logic. He had spent too many years following orders, doing what was practical and expected. The war had stolen his music, his home, his family. He refused to let it steal the one genuine feeling of hope he had experienced in years. He began to formulate a plan, dangerous and perhaps foolish, but the only path he could see forward. Sarah faced her own impossible choice. Her father had given her an ultimatum. She could remain under his roof only if she promised never to contact Klaus again. If she refused, she would need to leave and support herself, something nearly impossible for a single woman in 1945 with limited skills and a scandal attached to her name. Her father wasn't being cruel out of malice, she understood that. He was terrified of losing his daughter the way he might lose his son. Fear made people rigid. Martha offered Sarah a place to stay if she needed it, but both women knew that would only bring the controversy to Martha's doorstep. The widow had shown remarkable courage in defending Sarah, but there were limits to what the town would tolerate. Already, some customers had stopped buying eggs from Martha's farm, a small financial blow that could become larger if she sheltered the scandalous Sarah Mitchell. The deadlock broke in an unexpected way. News reached Greeley that the war in Europe was nearing its end. Germany was collapsing under the weight of Allied advances from both east and west. Hitler's regime was in its final days. The announcement brought celebration to most of the town, but for Sarah and Klaus, it brought a terrifying urgency. When the war ended, the prisoners would be processed for repatriation. Time was running out. Sarah made her decision on a warm April evening. She would meet Klaus one more time, regardless of the consequences. She would tell him what she needed to say before it was too late. She sent word through Corporal Davies, who had become a reluctant but sympathetic intermediary. Sunday evening, the old Miller barn on the county road, Please come. May 8, 1945. Victory in Europe Day. Church bells rang across Greeley, as they did in every American town, celebrating the end of the war that had consumed the world for 6 years. People poured into the streets, crying and laughing and embracing strangers. Flags waved from every storefront. The local bar opened its doors and announced free drinks for everyone. The nightmare was finally over. At the POW camp, the atmosphere was more subdued. The German prisoners had known for weeks that defeat was inevitable, but the official announcement still struck them with the weight of finality. Everything they had fought for, suffered for, lost friends and family for, had ended in complete failure. They gathered in small groups, speaking quietly in German, trying to process what this meant for their futures. Some felt relief that the killing was over. Others felt only shame and uncertainty. Klaus sat alone on his cot, holding the small wooden heart he had carved months ago but never given to Sarah. Their planned meeting at the Miller barn had never happened. On that Sunday evening, as Klaus had made his way toward the designated spot under the loose supervision of a sympathetic guard, he had been spotted by Sarah's father. William Mitchell had been waiting, having suspected his daughter might try something desperate. The confrontation had been brief and bitter, ending with Klaus being escorted back to camp and William dragging Sarah home. Since that night 3 weeks ago, Klaus had heard nothing from Sarah. He didn't know if she was safe, if she hated him now for the trouble he had caused, if she had moved on and accepted the reality of their situation. The not knowing was torture worse than anything he had experienced during the war, but it also offered hope to prisoners who had nothing to return to in Germany. Applications would be reviewed on a case-by-case basis, with preference given to those who had demonstrated good conduct and possessed needed skills. Klaus heard about the policy from Colonel Morrison during a meeting with prisoners who had expressed interest in staying. The colonel explained the requirements carefully. They would need an American sponsor willing to vouch for their character and provide initial housing. They would need guaranteed employment. Most importantly, they would need approval from local authorities who might object to former enemy soldiers remaining in their communities. "I won't lie to you," Morrison said. "It won't be easy, especially here in Greeley given recent events." But Klaus didn't care about easy. He immediately began drafting an application, his hands shaking as he wrote. Otto tried to discourage him, pointing out that Sarah's father would never allow them to be together, that the town would make their lives miserable. Klaus understood all of that, but he also understood that some things were worth fighting for even when the odds were impossible. He would rather try and fail than spend the rest of his life wondering what might have been. Sarah learned about the policy from Martha, who arrived at the Mitchell farm with the newspaper article and a determined expression. "There's a way," Martha said simply, laying the paper on the kitchen table, where William sat drinking coffee. "If Klaus applies to stay, and if he gets a sponsor, and if the authorities approve, he could remain here. Build a life. Maybe build a life with your daughter." William's face darkened. "You can't be serious. You're asking me to welcome an enemy soldier into my family?" Martha met his anger with calm resolve. "I'm asking you to look at your daughter, William. Really look at her. She's miserable. She barely eats. She doesn't sleep. You're so determined to protect her that you can't see you're the one hurting her most." The argument that followed was loud enough that Sarah heard it from upstairs, where her father had sent her to avoid Martha's visit. She crept to the top of the stairs, listening as these two people she cared about fought over her future. Martha's voice rose with passion. "I'll sponsor him myself if I have to. I'll give him work on my farm. I'll stand before the whole town and vouch for his character. And if you try to stop your daughter from seeing him, you'll lose her forever. Maybe not today, maybe not next month, but eventually she'll leave, and you'll have nothing but your stubborn pride to keep you warm." William said nothing for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice was tired and defeated. "What kind of father would I be if I allowed this?" August 15th, 1945. 3 months after victory in Europe, Klaus Richter stood in Colonel Morrison's office, receiving the news that would determine his future. His application to remain in the United States had been approved. Martha Weber had agreed to sponsor him, offering employment on her farm and housing in the small cottage behind her property. Several farmers, and even Reverend Thompson, had written letters of support. The local authorities, while not enthusiastic, had raised no formal objections. But the most surprising support had come from an unexpected source. William Mitchell had appeared at the final hearing and spoken on Klaus's behalf. His words had been grudging and brief, but their impact was profound. "I don't like this situation," he had told the committee, "but my daughter loves this man. And I've learned that a father's job isn't to choose who his children love. It's to stand by them when they make those choices, even the ones that scare him." Sarah had been waiting outside the administration building when Klaus emerged with his approval papers. She ran to him without caring who was watching, and for the first time, they embraced in daylight. Klaus held her as if she might disappear, his face buried in her hair, his shoulders shaking with relief and joy and the release of months of tension. "I'm staying," he whispered in her ear. "I'm staying with you." The wedding took place in October at Martha's farm, a small ceremony attended by those who had stood by them through the controversy. Reverend Thompson officiated, speaking about love that transcends boundaries and forgiveness that heals old wounds. Sarah wore her mother's dress, altered to fit her slender frame. Now, with Germany's surrender, he faced the certainty that he would be sent home soon. He might never learn what had happened to her. In town, Sarah stood on her front porch, listening to the celebration. She should have felt joy that the war was over, that her brother David would be coming home soon from wherever he was in Europe. But all she felt was emptiness. Her father had locked her in her room for 2 days after catching her attempting to meet Klaus. When he finally let her out, it was with the understanding that she was essentially a prisoner in her own home. He watched her constantly, accompanied her everywhere, made sure she had no opportunity to communicate with anyone who might carry messages to the camp. The victory celebration continued late into the night. Sarah lay in her bed listening to distant music and laughter. She thought about Klaus alone in his barracks, probably thinking she had abandoned him. She thought about all the things she had wanted to say to him, but never would. She thought about how strange it was that the war's end, which should have brought hope, instead felt like the final door closing on any chance they might have had. The repatriation process began within days of Germany's surrender. Officials from Washington arrived at camps across the country, with instructions for processing thousands of German prisoners for return to their defeated homeland. The prisoners would be held temporarily while transportation was arranged, likely several months, given the logistics of moving so many men across the Atlantic. At the Greeley camp, Colonel Morrison gathered the prisoners to explain the procedures they would face. Klaus listened with divided feelings. Part of him desperately wanted to return to Bavaria, to search for his mother and sister, to discover what remained of his home. But another part of him couldn't bear the thought of leaving without seeing Sarah one more time, without at least saying goodbye. He had written her a dozen letters that he had no way to send, pouring his heart onto pages that would probably never be read. In town, the celebration of victory gradually gave way to the practical business of returning to normal life. Families began preparing for the return of their sons and husbands from overseas. Businesses that had struggled with wartime shortages looked forward to better times ahead. But the division over Sarah Mitchell's relationship with the German prisoner remained an open wound. Some people were ready to forgive and forget, to put the whole unpleasant episode behind them. Others felt that letting such behavior go unpunished would send the wrong message. Martha Weber had become Sarah's most steadfast defender. She confronted Sarah's father directly one afternoon in front of the general store, her voice carrying across the street so that a small crowd gathered to listen. "William Mitchell, you're so busy protecting your daughter's reputation that you're destroying her spirit. That girl loves someone she shouldn't love. But love isn't something we can control, like crop rotation. Your rigid righteousness is pushing her away more surely than any German prisoner ever could." William's face flushed with anger and embarrassment. "You lost your husband to this war, Martha. How can you defend what she's done?" Martha's eyes filled with tears, but her voice remained steady. "I lost Robert to the Japanese, not to every person who happened to be on the wrong side of this war. I've seen those German boys working my fields. They're just boys, William, scared and lost and wanting to go home. If my husband were alive, he'd be the first to say that hatred has to end somewhere." The confrontation left the town buzzing with renewed debate. That evening, Reverend Thompson called an emergency meeting at the church. He had been wrestling with his own conscience about the situation, feeling guilty for his role in spreading the news that had caused Sarah such pain. Now he stood before a packed congregation and spoke about forgiveness, about the difference between justice and vengeance, about what it meant to claim Christian values while treating a young woman cruelly for the crime of caring about another human being. Not everyone was convinced by his words, but seeds of doubt had been planted. June brought news that changed everything. President Truman announced a new policy allowing certain German prisoners to remain in the United States if they could find sponsors and employment. The policy was designed to address the severe labor shortage in American agriculture and industry. Klaus wore a simple suit borrowed from Corporal Davies, who attended as a guest and witness to a love story he had helped nurture from its earliest days. Not everyone in Greeley accepted their marriage. Some families refused to associate with them. Certain stores wouldn't serve Klaus. But others, seeing their genuine happiness and Klaus's dedication to building a good life, gradually softened. He worked Martha's farm with tireless energy, saved money, and eventually bought a small property of his own. He began teaching piano lessons to local children, and slowly, music returned to his life. Years later, sitting on their porch watching their two children play in the yard, Sarah and Klaus would remember those dark days when loving each other had seemed impossible. They would think about the kindness of strangers who became family, about the courage it took to choose love over fear, and about how the end of one war had been the beginning of their life together. Their story became part of Greeley's history, told and retold, as proof that even in the darkest times, love could bridge the deepest divides. They had been enemies who became lovers, prisoners who became free, and strangers who became home to each other. And they had built that home not despite the war, but from the broken pieces it left behind.